Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Project Hypnos. Here I share real stories of unexplained encounters, sightings, disappearances, and strange lights in the sky to help you unwind, relax, and drift off to sleep. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop it in the comments if you would. Now, find a comfortable place to rest. Dim the lights, let the noise of the day fade away, and get ready for another set of encounters from the edge of what we understand. I was driving home from a late shift at the hospital where I work as a nurse, taking Highway 32 through rural Oregon around 3:15 a.m. on a foggy November night. It's a route I've driven hundreds of times, a winding two-lane road that cuts through farmland and forest with no streetlights and very little traffic during the overnight hours. I know every curve, every hill, and every landmark along the 30-mile stretch between the hospital and my house. About halfway through the drive, my headlights illuminated something that made me immediately slow down and question what I was seeing. Standing in the middle of the highway, perfectly centered between the yellow lines, was a small child, a girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, wearing what appeared to be a white nightgown or dress that seemed to glow in the beam of my headlights. She was standing completely motionless, facing away from me and looking straight down the road ahead. Her posture was unnaturally perfect, back straight, arms at her sides, feet together, like she was posing for a photograph or following precise instructions about how to stand. There was no movement at all, no swaying or shifting that you'd expect from a child standing alone on a dark highway. I slowed to a stop about 50 feet away, keeping my headlights on the child while trying to process what I was seeing. There were no houses visible anywhere nearby, no broken down vehicles that might explain why a child would be on the highway at that hour. The area was completely rural, with dense forest on both sides of the road and no driveways or access roads for miles in either direction. I sat in my car for several minutes, waiting for the child to move or react to the presence of my vehicle, but she remained perfectly still, maintaining the same rigid posture despite the bright headlights that must have been clearly visible to her. She didn't turn around, didn't wave for help, didn't show any of the normal responses you'd expect from a child who had encountered a car on a dark road. I honked my horn gently, thinking that perhaps she was disoriented or in some kind of shock that was preventing her from responding to her surroundings. But the sound produced no reaction. The child continued to stand motionless in the center of the highway, facing away from me with that same unnaturally perfect posture. Growing concerned that another vehicle might come around the curve behind me and not see the child in time to stop, I put on my hazard lights and got out of my car. The November air was cold and damp with fog, and I couldn't understand how a child in a thin dress could be standing comfortably in such conditions without showing any signs of being cold. "Are you okay?" I called out as I walked toward her. "Do you need help?" There was no response. As I got closer, I could see that the child was indeed a young girl with long, dark hair that hung straight down her back. Her skin was pale, almost luminous in the headlight beam, and her feet appeared to be bare despite the cold pavement and the fact that we were miles from any residence. When I was about 20 feet away, something made me stop. There was something wrong about the scene that I couldn't immediately identify, but every instinct I possessed was telling me not to get any closer. The child's stillness was too complete, too perfect. People don't stand motionless for minutes at a time, especially children in strange or frightening situations. Sweetie, where are your parents? I tried again, my voice carrying clearly in the still night air. How did you get here? The child's head began to turn slowly toward me, rotating with mechanical precision that was unlike any natural human movement. As her face came into view, I saw features that were perfect and symmetrical in a way that seemed artificial rather than naturally beautiful. Her eyes were completely black, with no visible pupils or irises, just dark surfaces that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. When she opened her mouth to speak, her voice carried clearly across the distance between us, despite the fact that she appeared to be speaking softly. Are you going home? She asked, tilting her head slightly to one side with the same mechanical precision she'd used to turn around. Something about her question and the way she asked it filled me with an overwhelming sense of dread. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on the child while moving toward my car. Yes, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I'm going home. Do you need me to call someone to help you? Can I come with you? She asked, taking a step forward with movements that were too smooth and controlled for a normal child. I want to go home too. Every survival instinct I possessed was screaming at me to get back in my car and drive away as quickly as possible. There was something fundamentally wrong about this child, something that went beyond her impossible presence on a remote highway in the middle of the night. Her voice, her movements, her black eyes, everything about her suggested something that was pretending to be human rather than actually being human. I need to call someone to help you first, I said, continuing to back toward my car. The police or social services, someone who can figure out where you belong. I belong with you, the child said, taking another step forward. I want to come home with you. Please don't leave me here. I reached my car and got inside as quickly as possible, locking the doors and putting the vehicle in gear. In my rearview mirror, I could see the child standing in the same spot where I'd first encountered her, once again facing away from me with that perfect, motionless posture. I drove away, checking my mirrors frequently to make sure the child wasn't following somehow. But she remained standing in the center of the highway, a small white figure illuminated by my taillights until I rounded a curve and she disappeared from view. When I reached the next town about 15 miles down the road, I stopped at a 24-hour gas station and called the police to report a child on the highway. I gave them the exact location and described what I'd seen, though I omitted the details about her black eyes and unnatural behavior, focusing instead on the basic facts that a young girl was standing alone on a dangerous road. 2 police officers responded to my report and drove out to investigate, but they found no sign of any child on Highway 32. They searched the area thoroughly, checking the roadside and the surrounding forest, but discovered no evidence that anyone had been there. According to their report, the highway was completely clear with no signs of disturbance or unusual activity. I've driven that same route hundreds of times since that November night, always slowing down when I reached the spot where I encountered the child. But I've never seen her again, and I've never found any explanation for what I experienced during those few minutes on the dark highway. I've researched reports of similar encounters, looking for other accounts of children appearing on remote roads under impossible circumstances. What I found was a small but consistent collection of stories from drivers who had encountered seemingly lost children in locations where no children should have been, often featuring the same details: black eyes, unnatural stillness, request to come home with the witnesses. The accounts typically described children who appeared normal at first glance, but who exhibited behaviors and characteristics that suggested they weren't entirely human. Most witnesses reported feeling intense dread or fear despite the apparently innocent nature of encountering a lost child, and many described the same sense that they were being tested or evaluated in ways they couldn't understand. I don't know what I encountered on Highway 32 that night, but I know it wasn't a normal human child in need of assistance. Whether it was some kind of supernatural entity, a manifestation of something that exists between our world and others, or a being that uses the appearance of vulnerability to interact with humans for purposes we can't comprehend. The child on the highway was something that belonged to a different category of existence than anything acknowledged in our normal understanding of reality. The highway continues to carry late-night traffic through that remote stretch of Oregon countryside, and occasionally other drivers probably encounter the same small figure standing motionless in the center of the road. But most people likely drive past without stopping, either not seeing her clearly in the darkness or instinctively understanding that some encounters are too dangerous to investigate, even when they appear to involve children who seem to need help. The child is still out there, waiting in the fog and darkness for drivers who might be curious enough or compassionate enough to stop and interact with something that wears the appearance of innocence while representing forces that exist beyond the boundaries of human understanding and definitely beyond the reach of normal assistance or protection. I was camping alone in the Algodones Dunes near the California-Arizona border, a sprawling desert region known for its massive sand formations and popular with off-road vehicle enthusiasts. I'd driven out there for a 3-day solo trip, setting up camp about 2 miles from the nearest access road, in an area where the dunes stretched unbroken to the horizon in every direction. It was late October, and the desert was experiencing one of those perfect autumn periods when daytime temperatures are comfortable and the nights are clear and cool. I'd spent the afternoon hiking and photographing the dramatic sand formations, enjoying the solitude and the sculptural beauty of dunes that shifted constantly in the wind. By evening, I was settled beside my tent with a camp chair and a good book, watching the sunset paint the sand in shades of gold and orange that seemed to glow from within. Around 8 p.m., just after full darkness had settled over the desert, I noticed movement in the sand about 50 yards from my campsite. At first, I thought it might be a sidewinder rattlesnake or some other desert wildlife creating disturbances as it moved through the loose sand. But as I watched more carefully, I realized that whatever was causing the movement was much larger than any animal that should have been active in the dunes after dark. The disturbance appeared as a long, sinuous line moving beneath the surface of the sand, creating a visible ridge that traveled slowly but steadily across the face of a large dune. The ridge was maybe 3 feet wide and extended for what looked like 30 or 40 feet, suggesting something enormous, moving through the sand like a massive snake or worm. I grabbed my flashlight and walked closer to get a better view of whatever was creating the subsurface movement. The beam illuminated the ridge clearly, showing that sand was being displaced from below by something substantial enough to push up a continuous mound as it traveled. The movement was smooth and controlled, following a deliberate path rather than the random wandering you'd expect from burrowing wildlife. What made the phenomenon truly extraordinary was its duration. The subsurface movement continued for over 40 minutes, with the ridge traveling back and forth across multiple dunes in patterns that seemed purposeful rather than random. Sometimes, the disturbance would disappear for a few minutes, only to reappear on a different dune, suggesting that whatever was causing it could move considerable distances underground. I tried to follow the ridge as it moved, hiking across the sand to keep pace with the disturbance, and trying to understand what could create such sustained underground activity. The sand was loose and deep, making it difficult for me to move quickly, but whatever was beneath the surface seemed to navigate the terrain effortlessly. At one point, the ridge passed within 10 feet of where I was standing, and I could hear sounds associated with the movement, a soft sliding or shifting noise that suggested large amounts of sand being displaced by something solid moving through it. The sound was rhythmic and mechanical, lacking the irregular patterns you'd expect from biological activity. I tried to estimate the size of whatever was creating the disturbance by measuring the width and height of the ridge it produced. Based on the amount of sand being displaced, the object moving beneath the surface had to be at least 6 or 8 feet in diameter and possibly much longer. The consistent speed and smooth movement suggested something that was perfectly adapted to subsurface travel through loose sand. Around 9 p.m., the movement pattern changed dramatically. Instead of the slow, steady progress I'd been observing, the ridge began moving in rapid circles and figure-8 patterns, as if whatever was beneath the sand had become agitated or was responding to some kind of stimulus. The speed increased significantly, with the disturbance racing across the dune faces faster than I could follow on foot. The circular movements continued for about 10 minutes before the ridge suddenly stopped in the center of a large dune about 100 yards from my campsite. For several minutes, there was no movement at all, and I began to think that whatever had been creating the disturbance had either gone deeper underground or had emerged somewhere I couldn't see. Then the sand in the center of the stationary ridge began to shift upward, forming a mound that grew larger and more pronounced over the course of several minutes. It looked like something was rising toward the surface, pushing up increasing amounts of sand as it approached ground level. I watched with growing excitement and apprehension, expecting to finally see whatever had been moving beneath the dunes for the past 40 minutes. But just as the mound reached its peak and looked like it was about to break through the surface, the entire disturbance collapsed inward, creating a depression in the sand where the ridge had been. The depression was perfectly circular, maybe 8 feet in diameter, and appeared to be quite deep based on the shadows created by my flashlight. I walked over to examine it more closely, but by the time I reached the location, the loose sand had already begun filling in the depression, erasing the evidence of whatever had briefly attempted to surface. I spent the rest of the evening scanning the dunes for any resumption of the underground movement, but the desert had returned to its normal quiet state. Whatever had been active beneath the sand for those 40 minutes had apparently departed or gone so deep that it was no longer creating surface disturbances. The next morning, I conducted a systematic search of the area where I'd observed the movements, looking for any physical evidence of what had created the disturbances. I found no tracks, no burrows, no shed skin, or other biological traces that might indicate what type of creature could move through sand with such size and persistence. I did find that the sand in the areas where the ridge had traveled was different from the surrounding dunes. It was more compacted and showed a slightly different grain structure, as if it had been subjected to pressure or heat that had altered its composition. The changes were subtle but noticeable when I compared sand samples from the movement areas with sand from undisturbed sections of the dunes. I researched desert wildlife that might explain what I'd observed, looking for information about large burrowing animals that could create sustained underground movement through sand dunes. But I found no desert species large enough or capable enough to account for the size and duration of the disturbances I'd witnessed. The closest match I could find was descriptions of the Mongolian deathworm, a legendary creature reported to move through sand dunes in the Gobi Desert. But those were folklore accounts without scientific verification, and they described a creature in a completely different geographical region with different ecological conditions. I also researched geological phenomena that might create the appearance of large objects moving beneath sand dunes. Some desert areas experience subsurface water flow that can cause sand movement, and certain types of seismic activity can create traveling disturbances in loose sediment. But none of these explanations accounted for the controlled, purposeful movement patterns I'd observed. The most intriguing possibility I found was research suggesting that some desert areas contain underground cavern systems that can be inhabited by unknown species adapted to subsurface environments. These cryptic ecosystems might support creatures that rarely or never surface, living entirely within networks of caves and tunnels beneath the visible landscape. I've returned to the Algodones dunes several times since that October night, always camping in the same general area and watching for any resumption of the underground movement. But I've never again witnessed anything like the sustained, purposeful disturbances that had tracked across multiple dunes for over 40 minutes. The experience changed how I think about desert environments and what might exist beneath the surfaces we assume are empty and lifeless. The sand dunes that appear to be nothing more than wind-blown geological formations might serve as habitat for creatures that have adapted to completely subsurface existence, emerging only rarely and briefly into the surface world that humans observe and study. Whatever moved beneath the Algodones dunes that night was large, persistent, and clearly capable of navigating complex underground terrain with remarkable skill. It operated according to patterns that suggested intelligence and purpose rather than random burrowing behavior, following routes and schedules that served functions I could only observe but never understand. The desert contains mysteries that exist literally beneath our feet, in the spaces between surface observation and deep geological processes. Something travels through the sand beneath some of our most familiar landscapes, following paths that connect underground territories we've never mapped and probably never suspected existed. The ridge that moved across those moonlit dunes was evidence of a hidden ecosystem that operates parallel to, but separate from the surface desert we think we know and understand. It happened during our monthly book club meeting at Sarah's house on a Thursday evening in November. 8 of us were gathered in her living room discussing the latest novel we'd read together when every phone in the room began ringing simultaneously at exactly 9:17 p.m. The synchronization was perfect, not staggered by even a fraction of a second, as if someone had triggered all our devices with a single command. What made the experience immediately unsettling wasn't just that unlikely coincidence of 8 different phones ringing at the same moment, but the fact that none of the devices displayed any caller identification. The screens showed incoming calls, but where the caller's name or number would normally appear, there was only blank space. No unknown number, no private caller, nothing. Just the standard incoming call interface with empty fields where identification information should have been. We looked around at each other in confusion as our phones continued to ring. Jennifer was the first to answer, sliding her finger across the screen to accept the call. But instead of hearing a voice, or even static, she was met with complete silence. She held the phone to her ear for several seconds, saying hello repeatedly, but there was no response from the other end of the line. One by one, the rest of us answered our ringing phones, and each of us experienced the same thing: absolute silence on the other end of the connection. Not the quiet of someone who wasn't speaking, but the profound absence of sound that suggests no active connection at all. Yet the call timers on our phones showed that the connections were active and ongoing. "This is really weird," said Mark, holding his phone away from his ear and looking at the screen. "It shows I'm connected to a call, but there's literally nothing there. No background noise, no breathing, no indication that there's anyone on the other end." We compared our phones and found that all 8 devices showed the same thing: active calls with no caller identification and no audio whatsoever. The call durations were ticking upward normally, indicating that our phones believed they were engaged in legitimate conversations, but the silence was complete and unnatural. Sarah tried hanging up and immediately calling back, but her phone displayed an error message saying the number couldn't be reached. When she checked her call history, there was no record of the silent call she'd just terminated, as if it had never occurred, despite the fact that we'd all witnessed her answering and speaking into the phone. The silent calls continued for exactly 10 minutes. During that time, we experimented with different responses, speaking into the phones, trying to make noise that might provoke a reaction, even playing music near the microphones to see if anything would elicit a response from whoever or whatever had initiated the calls. But the silence remained absolute, as if our phones were connected to empty space rather than another communication device. At 9:27 p.m., all 8 calls terminated simultaneously, just as they had begun. Our phones showed normal home screens, with no indication that anything unusual had occurred. When we checked our call histories, none of us had any record of receiving or participating in the mysterious calls, despite having spent 10 minutes actively engaged with them. Did that really just happen? Asked Lisa, scrolling through her phone's call log and finding no trace of the recent activity. I know I answered a call and held it for 10 minutes, but there's absolutely no record of it anywhere in my phone. We spent the next hour discussing what we'd experienced, trying to come up with rational explanations for the synchronized calling and the complete absence of audio or call records. Some suggested it might have been a technical glitch with our cellular provider, while others wondered if it could have been some kind of marketing test or social experiment. But none of our explanations adequately accounted for the precise synchronization of the calls, the absence of caller identification, or the fact that all evidence of the calls had been erased from our devices. We were using different cellular providers, different phone models, and different operating systems, yet we'd all experienced identical phenomena at exactly the same time. Jennifer, who works in telecommunications, pointed out that legitimate network issues typically affect users randomly, rather than targeting specific individuals simultaneously. For all 8 of our phones to receive synchronized calls with identical characteristics, someone would have to be deliberately targeting our specific devices, she said. That's not how network glitches work. The following week, we met again for our regular book club session, and inevitably the conversation turned to the mysterious phone calls. None of us had experienced similar incidents during the intervening days, and research into cellular network problems hadn't revealed any widespread issues that might explain what we'd encountered. About halfway through our meeting, at 8:43 p.m., our phones rang again. This time, we were prepared and paid closer attention to the details of what was happening. Once again, all 8 devices rang in perfect synchronization, displayed no caller identification, and connected to calls that produced no audio whatsoever. This time, we tried more systematic experiments. We put several phones on speaker to see if the silence was consistent across devices, tried conference calling between our phones to see if we could communicate through whatever system was connecting us, and even attempted to record the conversations using voice recording apps. The results were the same as before: complete silence that lasted exactly 10 minutes before all calls terminated simultaneously. But this time, Jennifer noticed something additional. During the silent calls, her phone's data usage indicator showed that information was being transmitted despite the absence of any audio. Something is definitely happening during these calls, she said, showing us her phone's real-time data usage display. There's a steady stream of data being sent and received, even though we can't hear anything. Whatever this is, it's not just a prank or a technical error. We started keeping detailed logs of the incidents, noting the exact timing, duration, and any technical details we could observe. Over the following months, the synchronized calls occurred every few weeks, always during our book club meetings, and always with the same characteristics. The pattern suggested that whoever was initiating the calls knew our schedule and was deliberately targeting our group during our regular gatherings. But none of us could think of any reason why someone would want to subject us to repeated silent phone calls, or what purpose the mysterious data transmissions might serve. Mark, who has a background in computer security, suggested that our phones might be being used for some kind of remote monitoring or data collection. These calls could be a way of activating our microphones or cameras without our knowledge. he said. The silence might be covering up surveillance activities that are happening in the background. We started turning off our phones during book club meetings, but the calls continued to come through even when our devices were powered down. Somehow, the mysterious calling system was able to activate our phones and initiate connections even when we had deliberately disabled them. The most unsettling incident occurred during a meeting when we had placed all our phones in a metal box that should have blocked all radio signals. Despite being completely isolated from cellular and Wi-Fi networks, our phones still rang simultaneously at the usual time, connected to the same silent calls, and transmitted the same mysterious data. This is beyond any normal telecommunications capability, Jennifer said after examining the technical logs from that evening. Whatever system is contacting us doesn't rely on standard cellular networks or radio frequencies. It's accessing our phones through methods that bypass normal communication protocols. We eventually stopped meeting at Sarah's house, thinking that the calls might be somehow connected to that specific location. But when we met at different members' homes, the synchronized calls followed us, occurring with the same timing and characteristics, regardless of where we gathered. The mysterious phone calls continue to this day, arriving every few weeks during our book club meetings with clockwork regularity. We've learned to expect them and have stopped trying to answer or interact with them, instead treating them as a bizarre but predictable interruption to our literary discussions. Whatever system is contacting us operates with capabilities that exceed anything in civilian telecommunications technology, able to simultaneously activate multiple phones regardless of their power state or network connectivity. The call serves some purpose that we're not meant to understand, transmitting data through connections that exist parallel to but separate from normal phone service. Our book club has become inadvertently involved in some kind of monitoring or communication system that treats our regular gatherings as opportunities for mysterious data collection. The calls remind us that our personal devices are more permeable than we assume, accessible to systems that can override normal security measures and establish connections that leave no trace in official records. We continue to meet and discuss literature, but with the knowledge that our conversations are periodically interrupted by contact from sources that possess technological capabilities extending far beyond anything acknowledged in public telecommunications infrastructure. The silent calls serve as regular reminders that our phones connect us not just to each other, but to monitoring systems that operate according to protocols we're not supposed to understand or even notice. I've been an amateur astronomer for over 20 years, photographing everything from planets to deep space objects using a computerized telescope setup in my backyard observatory. My equipment is sophisticated enough to track celestial objects automatically and capture detailed images through long exposures, but it's also sensitive enough to occasionally record things that aren't supposed to be there. What I captured on the night of October 15th challenged everything I thought I knew about what moves through the space above our atmosphere. I was photographing the Orion Nebula using a 30-minute exposure with my telescope locked onto the target and automatically compensating for Earth's rotation to keep the celestial object perfectly centered in the frame. It was a clear night with excellent atmospheric conditions, the kind of evening that produces sharp, detailed images of distant galaxies and nebulae. My camera was a high sensitivity CCD unit designed specifically for astronomical photography, capable of detecting extremely faint objects that would be invisible to the naked eye. When I reviewed the images the next morning, I found something in one of the frames that shouldn't have been there. A bright streak crossed the entire field of view, but it wasn't the typical trail left by a satellite or aircraft. This object had moved so fast that it appeared as a perfectly straight line across the 30-minute exposure, suggesting a speed that was far beyond anything I'd ever recorded. Satellites typically create curved trails in long exposure astronomical photographs because they follow orbital paths around Earth. Aircraft leave shorter, more irregular trails because they change direction and altitude during their flight paths. But this object had created a completely straight line from one edge of the image to the other, indicating that it had traveled in a perfectly linear trajectory at tremendous speed. I calculated that object's apparent velocity using the known field of view of my telescope and the duration of the exposure. Based on the length of the trail and the time it would have taken to cross the frame, the object was moving at approximately 40,000 miles per hour, roughly twice the speed of anything in low Earth orbit, and far faster than any known aircraft or spacecraft. My first assumption was that I'd captured the trail of a meteor or piece of space debris entering Earth's atmosphere, but meteors create bright flashes that fade quickly as they burn up, and they typically follow curved paths influenced by gravity and atmospheric drag. This object had maintained constant brightness and a perfectly straight trajectory throughout its passage across my telescope's field of view. I checked space tracking websites to see if any known satellites or spacecraft had been visible in that area of sky during my observation time, but none of the cataloged objects matched the trajectory or timing of what I'd captured. The object had passed through an area of space that should have been empty of any human-made objects. Over the following weeks, I reviewed all my archived images from the past year, looking for similar trails that I might have missed during routine processing. What I found was a pattern of high-speed objects that had been regularly crossing my telescope's field of view, usually too faint to notice unless I enhanced the contrast and brightness of the images. The objects appeared in about 1 out of every 50 images I captured, always moving in straight lines at speeds that exceeded anything in Earth orbit. Some trails were bright enough to be obvious, while others were so faint they were barely detectable even with digital enhancement. But they all shared the same characteristics: linear trajectories, extreme velocity, and brightness levels that remained constant throughout their passage. I started modifying my observation schedule to capture more images of the same sky regions, hoping to record additional sightings and establish patterns in the object's movements. What I discovered was that the high-speed objects appeared most frequently during certain times of night and in specific areas of sky, suggesting regular traffic patterns rather than random events. The most productive observation period was between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., when I would typically capture 3 or 4 trails per hour during active periods. The objects seemed to follow corridors across the sky, with multiple sightings occurring along similar trajectories, separated by minutes or hours. It was as if I were observing a highway system for extremely fast moving craft that operated according to schedules and routes. I contacted other amateur astronomers through online forums, sharing examples of the trails I'd captured and asking if anyone else had recorded similar phenomena. The response was surprising. Several experienced astrophotographers confirmed that they'd been seeing similar high-speed objects for years, but most had dismissed them as satellite glints, cosmic rays hitting camera sensors, or other technical artifacts. Dr. Mark Patterson, an astronomer at a nearby university who specialized in near-Earth object detection, agreed to examine my images and help analyze the data. His initial reaction was skeptical, but when he calculated the velocities and trajectories involved, he admitted that the objects I'd recorded were unlike anything in his experience. These speeds are impossible for anything operating within Earth's atmosphere, he told me after reviewing dozens of my images. And they're too fast for conventional spacecraft in any known orbital configuration. Whatever you're photographing is either using propulsion technology that we don't understand, or it's operating in a region of space where normal physics don't apply. Dr. Patterson helped me set up a more systematic observation program using multiple telescopes pointed at different areas of sky to triangulate the positions and calculate more precise velocities for the objects. The coordinated observations confirmed that the objects were real, physical phenomena moving through space at speeds that challenged conventional understanding of spacecraft capabilities. The most remarkable discovery came when we captured simultaneous images of the same object from two different locations, allowing us to calculate its actual distance from Earth. Instead of being satellites in low orbit, as we'd initially assumed, the objects appeared to be traveling through space at distances of several thousand miles above Earth's surface, far higher than any conventional spacecraft operate. At those distances, the objects would need to be enormous to appear as bright as they did in our images. Using standard calculations for apparent brightness versus actual size, we estimated that the objects were several hundred feet in length, making them larger than any known spacecraft, but still capable of maneuvering at velocities that would destroy any conventional vehicle. I continued documenting the high-speed objects for over a year, building a database of hundreds of sightings that revealed patterns in their behavior and flight paths. The objects operated in groups, following similar routes across the sky and appearing most frequently during specific lunar phases and seasonal periods. Most disturbing was the evidence that the objects were aware of ground-based observation. During periods when multiple amateur astronomers were conducting coordinated observations, the objects would change their usual patterns, appearing in different areas of skies or modifying their trajectories in ways that suggested they were avoiding systematic surveillance. I eventually stopped publicizing my observations after receiving visits from individuals who claimed to represent various government agencies interested in my astronomical data. They were polite but insistent about acquiring copies of my images and observation logs, and they strongly suggested that I refrain from sharing my findings with other researchers or media outlets. I continue to photograph the night sky, but I've learned to be more discreet about documenting the high-speed objects that regularly cross my telescope's field of view. The phenomena I've recorded over the past 2 years represents traffic in Earth's orbital environment that operates according to capabilities and schedules that aren't acknowledged in any public documentation of space activities. Whatever I've been photographing moves through space near Earth at velocities that exceed known propulsion technologies, following routes that suggest purpose and coordination rather than random trajectories. The objects are large enough and bright enough to be easily detected by professional astronomical surveillance systems, but they don't appear in any public databases of space objects or satellite tracking information. The night sky contains far more activity than most people realize, with craft that operate in the space above our atmosphere using technologies and flight patterns that exist beyond the boundaries of publicly acknowledged space programs. My telescope has provided a window into activities that occur regularly in Earth orbit, but remain invisible to ground-based observers who aren't looking for phenomena that move too fast and too purposefully to be explained by conventional spacecraft or natural objects. The images I've captured represent evidence of space traffic that challenges basic assumptions about what operates in the environment around our planet, suggesting that Earth orbit is shared by vehicles that possess capabilities extending far beyond anything documented in official aerospace literature. The trails that streak across my astronomical photographs are proof that we're not alone in our use of near-Earth space, and that other operators are conducting activities above our atmosphere using craft that move through space with speeds and precision that redefine what we think is possible for vehicles operating beyond Earth's surface. My cat Luna went missing on a Wednesday morning in early May, slipping out through the front door while I was bringing in the mail. She was an indoor cat who had never shown much interest in the outdoors, so I was immediately concerned when I realized she'd vanished. I spent that entire day searching the neighborhood, posting flyers and checking with animal shelters, but found no trace of her anywhere. Luna was a distinctive tortoiseshell with unusual amber eyes and a white patch on her chest shaped like a crescent moon, which was how she'd gotten her name. She'd never worn a collar because she lived exclusively indoors, and she wasn't microchipped, something I'd been meaning to take care of, but had never gotten around to doing. At 3 years old, she was timid around strangers and unlikely to approach people who might have helped her find her way home. 4 days later, I was sitting on my front porch, hoping to spot Luna in the neighborhood when I saw her walking calmly up the sidewalk toward our house. She looked completely normal, healthy, clean, and showing no signs of having spent days surviving outdoors. But she was wearing a collar I'd never seen before, a simple black band with a small metal tag that caught the afternoon sunlight. Luna walked directly to the front door and sat down, waiting for me to let her inside, exactly as if she'd simply been out for a brief walk rather than missing for 4 days. When I picked her up, she seemed relaxed and content, purring normally and showing no signs of stress or trauma from her mysterious absence. The collar was made of material I couldn't identify. It felt like leather, but was unusually soft and lightweight, with no visible seams or buckles. The tag was small and circular, made of what appeared to be polished metal, but instead of contact information or a pet's name, it contained symbols, that didn't match any alphabet or language I recognized. The symbols were etched into the metal with precise angular lines that formed patterns that seemed almost technological rather than decorative. There were maybe a dozen different characters, arranged in 2 rows, each one unique, but sharing design elements that suggested they were part of a coherent writing system. I tried to remove the collar to examine it more closely, but I couldn't find any mechanism for opening or adjusting it. There was no buckle, no clasp, no apparent way to take it off, despite the fact that it fit Luna perfectly, snug enough to stay in place, but loose enough to be comfortable. The collar seemed to be a complete circle with no break or joining point anywhere along its circumference. Over the following days, I researched the symbols on the tag, comparing them to every writing system I could find online. I checked ancient alphabets, modern constructed languages, mathematical notation, and even occult symbols, but found nothing that matched the precise characters etched into Luna's collar tag. I also tried to determine where the collar might have come from by visiting local pet stores, veterinary clinics, and animal shelters to see if anyone recognized the design or materials. But no one I spoke with had ever seen anything like it, and several people commented that the collar's construction was unlike anything currently available in pet supply markets. The strangest thing about Luna's return was her behavior in the weeks that followed. She had always been a somewhat nervous cat who startled easily and preferred to hide when strangers visited, but now she seemed calmer and more confident, approaching visitors with curiosity rather than fear and displaying an awareness of her surroundings that seemed unusually acute. She also began exhibiting behaviors I'd never observed before. Luna would sit at windows for hours, staring intently at the sky with the kind of focused attention that cats usually reserve for birds or small animals. But she wasn't watching wildlife. She seemed to be tracking something in the distance that I couldn't see, following invisible movements with her eyes and occasionally making soft chirping sounds. Most unusual was her reaction to certain electronic devices. Luna had never paid attention to televisions, radios, or computers before her disappearance, but now she would approach these devices when they were turned on and sit very close to them, as if she were listening to something that wasn't audible to human ears. I took Luna to our veterinarian for a checkup, partly to make sure she was healthy after her mysterious absence, and partly to see if the vet could help remove the unusual collar. Dr. Patricia Wells examined Luna thoroughly and found her to be in excellent condition, better health than before her disappearance, with a shinier coat and brighter eyes than I remembered. But Dr. Wells was as puzzled by the collar as everyone else had been. "I've never seen a pet collar made from this type of material," she said, running her fingers along the seamless band, "and I have no idea how to remove it. There's literally no opening mechanism that I can identify." She tried using various tools to find a hidden clasp or cutting point, but the collar appeared to be genuinely seamless. "It's as if it were molded directly onto her neck," Dr. Wells said, "but that's impossible. There's no way to create a solid ring around an animal without some kind of opening mechanism." What concerned Dr. Wells most was that she couldn't determine what the collar was made of. "It feels organic, almost like living tissue, but it's clearly some kind of manufactured material. I've never encountered anything like it in 30 years of veterinary practice." I tried contacting local animal control and police departments to report Luna's return and the mysterious collar, thinking that perhaps someone in the area might be missing a cat with similar coloring and that the collar might provide a clue to her identity. But no one had reported a missing tortoiseshell cat, and none of the authorities I spoke with had any suggestions for identifying the source of the unusual collar. 3 weeks after Luna's return, I discovered something that made the mystery even more perplexing. While cleaning out a closet, I found Luna's old medical records from when I'd first adopted her from the animal shelter. According to the paperwork, Luna had been spayed during her initial veterinary care, but Dr. Wells's recent examination had found no evidence of spay surgery. When I called Dr. Wells to ask about this discrepancy, she was as confused as I was. "I examined her very carefully," she said. "There are definitely no surgical scars or any indication that she's been spayed. But according to these records, the procedure was performed 3 years ago by my own clinic." Dr. Wells offered to re-examine Luna and compare her current condition with the detailed notes from her previous visits. But when we scheduled the appointment, we discovered that all of Luna's medical files had somehow been corrupted or deleted from the clinic's computer system, leaving no digital record of her previous care. 6 months later, the collar remained seamlessly attached to Luna's neck, showing no signs of wear or aging despite daily exposure to normal cat activities. The symbols on the tag are as crisp and clear as the day she returned home, and the material continues to resist identification or analysis. Luna has adapted well to her new collar, showing no signs of discomfort or irritation from wearing it constantly. If anything, she seems healthier and more energetic than before her disappearance, as if the collar were somehow beneficial rather than simply decorative. I've stopped trying to remove the collar or identify its origins, accepting that Luna's 4-day absence was part of an experience that exists beyond my ability to understand or explain. Whatever happened to her during those missing days changed her in subtle but significant ways, and the collar serves as a permanent reminder that she returned from somewhere that operates according to different rules than our familiar domestic environment. Sometimes I wonder if Luna was chosen for some kind of experiment or observation, selected by entities who needed to study domestic cat behavior or who were conducting research that required temporary borrowing of pets from unsuspecting owners. The collar might be a tracking device, a monitoring system, or simply a marker that identifies her as having participated in activities that I'm not supposed to know about. Luna seems content with her mysterious collar and her enhanced awareness of the world around her. She continues to watch the sky with unusual intensity and to respond to electronic devices in ways that suggest she's perceiving information that remains hidden from human senses. Whatever knowledge or experience she gained during her missing days has made her a different cat, one who exists partially in our familiar domestic world and partially in some other realm that marked her with symbols I'll never be able to decode. The collar that wasn't hers has become hers permanently, a seamless addition to her identity that connects her to experiences and places that I can only observe through the changes in her behavior. Luna returned from her mysterious absence, carrying evidence of contact with something that operates beyond the boundaries of normal pet ownership, something that borrowed her briefly and then returned her enhanced, monitored, and permanently marked as having crossed the threshold between our mapped domestic world and territories that remain unmapped and unexplained. I worked as a seasonal park ranger at Glacier Ridge State Park in northern Montana for 4 summers during college, maintaining trails, conducting wildlife surveys, and helping visitors navigate the 50,000-acre wilderness area. The park contains over 200 miles of documented hiking trails, and I knew every one of them, their difficulty ratings, their seasonal conditions, and their precise routes through the mountainous terrain. That's what made the assignment I received on July 23, 2018, so puzzling and ultimately disturbing. I was called into the park office early that Monday morning by my supervisor, Janet Morrison, who had been managing Glacier Ridge for over 15 years. She handed me a work order that was different from the usual trail maintenance assignments I'd been handling all summer. Instead of specifying repairs needed on established trails, this order directed me to clear and restore something called the White Bark Loop Trail. I've never heard of the White Bark Loop, I told Janet, scanning the work order for additional details. Is this a new trail designation, or maybe an old trail that's been closed for years? Janet looked uncomfortable with my question, shuffling through paperwork on her desk before responding. It's an existing trail that needs attention, she said. The GPS coordinates are on the work order. Just follow the coordinates, clear any fallen trees or overgrowth, and make sure the trail markers are visible and properly positioned. The coordinates led to an area of the park that I knew well, a section of dense forest about 8 miles from the main visitor center, accessible by one of the established trails that I'd hiked dozens of times. But according to my knowledge of the park's trail system, there was no designated hiking trail in that specific location. I loaded my truck with chainsaws, hand tools, and trail marking supplies, then drove to the closest access point and began hiking toward the coordinates Janet had provided. The route took me along the familiar Glacier Creek Trail for about 3 miles, then required me to leave the established path and bushwhack through unmarked forest terrain. When I reached the GPS coordinates, I found myself in an area of mature pine forest that showed no obvious signs of ever having been a designated trail. There were no trail markers, no cleared pathway, no evidence of the regular foot traffic that creates visible trails through wilderness areas. But as I examined the terrain more carefully, I began to notice subtle signs that suggested human activity in the distant past. Fallen trees had been cut and moved aside in a rough line that extended deeper into the forest, creating a corridor that was barely perceptible but definitely deliberate. Ancient blazes on tree trunks, cuts made decades earlier to mark trail routes, were still faintly visible despite being overgrown with bark and obscured by forest growth. Most puzzling were the trail markers I discovered as I followed the faint pathway. Standard Park Service signs were mounted on trees at regular intervals, weathered and faded, but clearly indicating that this was officially designated as the White Bark Loop Trail. The signs included distance markers, difficulty ratings, and regulatory information that matched the format used throughout the park system. But these markers didn't appear on any trail maps I'd ever seen, and the trail itself wasn't included in any of the park documentation I was familiar with. According to everything I knew about Glacier Ridge State Park, the White Bark Loop Trail simply didn't exist, yet here was clear evidence that it had been officially established and maintained at some point in the past. I spent the next 2 days clearing fallen trees, cutting back overgrown vegetation, and following the obscure trail markers deeper into the forest. The route was approximately 6 miles long, forming a loop that eventually connected back to the Glacier Creek Trail about half a mile from where I'd initially entered the unmarked terrain. The trail led through some of the most beautiful and remote areas of the park: pristine meadows, scenic overlooks, and old-growth forest that rivaled anything available on the established trail system. But despite its obvious recreational value, the White Bark Loop showed no signs of recent use. I found no footprints, no litter, no evidence that hikers had been using the trail in recent years. As I worked to restore the trail to usable condition, I discovered additional puzzling elements. Several wooden bridges crossed streams along the route, constructed with the same materials and techniques used throughout the park, but showing years of neglect and weather damage. Interpretive signs described local ecology and geological features, but they were so faded that the text was barely readable. Most disturbing was a trail register box positioned at what appeared to be the halfway point of the loop. Trail registers are standard equipment on wilderness trails, allowing hikers to sign in and providing park management with data about trail usage. But when I opened the weathered metal box, I found logbooks dating back over 20 years, filled with entries from hikers who had apparently been using the White Bark Loop regularly during the 1990s and early 2000s. The register entries describe the trail as one of the park's most scenic routes, praising its solitude and the quality of wildlife viewing opportunities it provided. Some hikers had made multiple entries over several years, suggesting that the White Bark Loop had been a popular destination for people who appreciated challenging, less crowded hiking experiences. But the entries stopped abruptly in 2003, with no explanation for why hikers had stopped using what appeared to be an excellent trail. The final entry was dated September 15th, 2003, written by someone who noted that the trail was becoming overgrown and suggested that park maintenance was needed to keep it accessible. When I completed the trail restoration and returned to the park office, I asked Janet about the history of the White Bark Loop and why it had been allowed to fall into such poor condition. Her response was evasive and seemed designed to discourage further questions. "Some trails get more use than others," she said. "We have limited maintenance resources, so we focus on the routes that serve the most visitors. The White Bark Loop is available for experienced hikers who want a more challenging experience." But when I asked why the trail didn't appear on any park maps or trail guides, Janet became uncomfortable and suggested that I focus on my assigned duties rather than questioning park management decisions. She also mentioned that trail information was updated regularly and that not all routes were necessarily included in materials provided to general park visitors. I tried researching the White Bark Loop through park records and historical documents, hoping to understand when it had been established and why it had apparently been removed from official trail systems. But I found no mention of the trail in any documentation I could access, as if it had been systematically erased from park records. My inquiries eventually attracted attention from higher levels of park management. I was called into a meeting with the regional supervisor, who informed me that some trails in the park system served special purposes and that detailed questions about their status or history weren't appropriate for seasonal employees. Your job is to maintain trails as assigned, he told me. Trail designation and visitor management are administrative decisions that don't require input from maintenance staff. I trust you understand the importance of focusing on your assigned responsibilities. The message was clear. Stop asking questions about the White Bark Loop Trail. I completed the restoration work as assigned, then spent the rest of the summer maintaining established trails and avoiding any mention of the mysterious loop that I'd cleared, but that officially didn't exist. I never worked at Glacier Ridge State Park again, transferring to a different park system the following summer, partly because I felt uncomfortable with the evasive responses I'd received about legitimate questions regarding park trails. But I've never stopped wondering about the White Bark Loop and why a beautiful, well-constructed trail would be removed from official documentation while remaining physically present in the forest. I suspect that the White Bark Loop serves purposes that aren't related to normal recreational hiking, perhaps providing access for research activities, monitoring equipment, or other operations that require discrete routes through remote areas of the park. The trail's removal from public documentation would ensure that only authorized personnel would know about its existence and location. The experience taught me that public lands sometimes contain infrastructure that serves functions beyond what's acknowledged in official materials provided to visitors. Trails, facilities, and access routes exist throughout our park systems that operate according to purposes and authorizations that extend beyond recreational use, maintained by staff who understand that some questions about their assignments aren't supposed to be asked or answered. The White Bark Loop Trail remains in the forest where I restored it, probably continuing to serve whatever functions required its creation and maintenance, while remaining invisible to hikers who use the official trail system. Somewhere in park management files, there are records that document its real purpose and authorize its continued existence, but those records remain classified at levels that seasonal rangers aren't supposed to access or even know about. The trail that didn't exist taught me that our public lands contain layers of use and purpose that extend far beyond what we see in visitor guides and recreational maps, and that sometimes the most important work done by park staff involves maintaining access to areas and activities that the general public is never supposed to discover or understand. I woke up on a Thursday morning in late September to find 5 distinct handprints pressed into the textured ceiling directly above my bed. The prints were clearly visible in the white paint, appearing as slightly depressed areas where someone had apparently placed their hands against the ceiling with enough force to leave permanent impressions in the surface. What made this discovery particularly disturbing was that my bedroom ceiling is 9 feet high, and there was no possible way for anyone to reach it from floor level. The handprints were positioned in a rough circle, each one showing clear details of palm prints and individual finger impressions. They appeared to be adult-sized hands, larger than my own, and the depth of the impressions suggested that considerable pressure had been applied to create them. The positioning was deliberate rather than random. 5 hands arranged in a pattern that seemed purposeful and symmetrical. I stood on my bed to examine the prints more closely, and what I found was even more unsettling than their impossible location. The impressions were warm to the touch, several degrees above the ambient room temperature, as if they had been made recently by hands that had generated heat. The surrounding ceiling area was normal temperature, but the handprints themselves retained warmth that suggested they were somehow still connected to whatever had created them. My first thought was that someone had somehow entered my bedroom during the night and used a ladder or other equipment to reach the ceiling. But my bedroom door had been locked from the inside. The windows were secured and showed no signs of disturbance, and there was no equipment anywhere in the room that could have provided access to the ceiling height. I checked the rest of my apartment thoroughly, looking for any signs of intrusion or any explanation for how someone could have gained access to create the handprints, but everything else appeared normal and undisturbed. Nothing was missing, nothing was damaged, and there were no footprints, tool marks, or other evidence that anyone had been in my home during the night. The apartment is on the 3rd floor of a building with no external access to the windows, and the only entrance is through the front door, which requires a key and had been locked when I went to sleep. Even if someone had somehow entered my bedroom, the physical impossibility of reaching a 9-foot ceiling to create clear handprints remained unexplained. I called my landlord to report what I thought might be a maintenance issue with the ceiling, suggesting that perhaps settling or water damage had created unusual marks in the textured surface. But when he came to examine the handprints, he was as puzzled as I was by their appearance and the impossibility of their creation. "These are definitely handprints," he said, running his fingers over the impressed areas. "Someone pressed their hands into the ceiling with considerable force, but I have no idea how they could have reached that height, and I've never seen anything like this in 30 years of property management." He took photographs of the handprints and promised to research whether similar phenomena had been reported in other units of the building. But he also suggested that I might want to consider changing my locks, even though there were no signs of forced entry or any logical explanation for how an intruder could have created ceiling impressions. Over the following days, I researched everything I could find about unusual handprint phenomena, looking for scientific explanations involving settling, temperature changes, or other building-related factors that might create the appearance of human handprints in ceiling surfaces. But I found nothing that adequately explained the clear detail and warm temperature of the impressions I'd discovered. I also started paying closer attention to sounds and disturbances during the night, wondering if I might have slept through activity that could explain the handprints. But my sleep had been normal and undisturbed, and I had no memory of any unusual sounds, movements, or other disturbances that might have occurred while the impressions were being created. A week after discovering the first handprints, I woke up to find 3 additional prints on the ceiling, positioned near the foot of my bed in the same deliberate pattern as the original 5. These new impressions showed the same characteristics: clear detail, warm temperature, and depth that indicated significant pressure applied from above rather than below. The accumulation of handprints convinced me that whatever was creating them was an ongoing phenomenon rather than a single incident. Something was repeatedly accessing my bedroom ceiling during the night, leaving evidence of its presence in ways that defied physical explanation. The pattern suggested systematic activity rather than random occurrence. I installed a motion activated camera in my bedroom, hoping to capture evidence of whatever was creating the handprints. But the camera recorded nothing unusual during the nights when new impressions appeared. The footage showed me sleeping normally, with no movement or activity visible in the room, yet I would wake up to find fresh handprints that hadn't been there the evening before. Most unsettling was a night when I was awakened around 3 a.m. by what felt like pressure against the mattress, as if someone were pressing down on the bed from above. I opened my eyes and looked up at the ceiling, but saw nothing unusual in the darkness. The pressure sensation lasted for several minutes before gradually fading, and in the morning I found two new handprints directly above where I had been lying. I tried staying awake all night several times, hoping to observe the creation of the handprints in real time. But on nights when I remained conscious and alert, no new impressions appeared. The phenomenon seemed to require my unconsciousness, occurring only when I was deeply asleep and unable to witness whatever process was creating the marks. The handprints continued to accumulate over the following months, eventually covering most of the ceiling area above my bed. Each new impression appeared during deep sleep, and each one retained the same warm temperature and clear detail that characterized the original prints. The pattern suggested mapping or systematic exploration, as if something were methodically documenting the ceiling space above my sleeping area. I consulted with a sleep specialist, thinking that perhaps I was experiencing some form of sleepwalking that might explain the handprints. But sleep studies showed that I experienced normal sleep patterns with no episodes of complex motor activity or extended periods of wakefulness that I wasn't remembering. The handprints you're describing couldn't be created by sleepwalking, the specialist explained. Even if you were moving during sleep, you couldn't reach a 9-foot ceiling, and you certainly couldn't apply the kind of pressure necessary to create permanent impressions in a textured surface. 6 months after the first handprints appeared, I moved to a different apartment, hoping that whatever was creating the ceiling impressions was somehow connected to the specific location rather than to me personally. But within a week of settling into my new bedroom, I woke up to find familiar handprints pressed into the ceiling above my bed. The phenomenon has continued for over 2 years now, occurring every few weeks, regardless of where I sleep. Hotels, friends' houses, even camping in a tent. Wherever I spend the night, I occasionally wake up to find new handprints on whatever surface is above my sleeping area. The impressions always show the same characteristics and always appear during periods of deep sleep when I have no conscious awareness of their creation. I've stopped trying to prevent or explain the handprints, accepting them as a regular feature of my sleeping environment. Whatever creates them operates according to rules I don't understand, accessing the space above my bed through methods that bypass normal physical limitations. The warm temperature of fresh prints suggests that the phenomenon involves some form of presence or contact, but the complete absence of visual evidence means I can only experience its effects rather than observe its cause. The handprints serve as a reminder that the boundary between sleeping and waking consciousness is more permeable than we assume, and that activities can occur in our most private spaces without our awareness or consent. Something reaches down from above while I sleep, leaving evidence of its presence in impressions that document contact between my unconscious state and entities that exist beyond the normal range of Waken's perception. Whether the handprints represent attempts at communication, systematic monitoring, or some other purpose I can't comprehend, they continue to appear with patient regularity, mapping the ceilings above my sleeping form and creating archives of contact that exist only in the impressed surfaces that I discover each morning when I wake up to find new evidence that my sleep is shared with presences that operate in the spaces between consciousness and dreams. My friend Alex and I have been recording a weekly podcast about local history from the spare bedroom I've converted into a home studio. It's nothing fancy, just a couple of decent microphones, some acoustic foam on the walls, and a digital recorder that captures our conversations about forgotten stories from our town's past. We've been doing this for about 2 years, and I've become familiar with the normal sounds that occasionally bleed into our recordings. Distant traffic, the neighbor's dog, the hum of the air conditioning cycling on and off. Last Tuesday evening, we were recording an episode about the old Riverside Theater that burned down in 1952, discussing what little information we'd been able to find about the fire and the people who had worked there. About 20 minutes into our conversation, Alex was describing the theater's final performance when we both heard a third voice join the discussion. It was a woman's voice, clear and distinct, speaking with the kind of precise diction that suggests someone from an earlier era. The fire wasn't an accident, the voice said, interrupting Alex mid-sentence. Margaret knew what was going to happen, but she couldn't stop it. Alex and I both stopped talking immediately, looking at each other with expressions of confusion and alarm. We were alone in the room. The door was closed, and there was no way for anyone else's voice to be picked up by our microphones unless they were speaking directly into them from close range. "Did you hear that?" Alex whispered, pointing at the recording equipment, as if the voice might have come from the digital recorder itself. I nodded, checking to make sure our equipment was working normally. The recording levels were fine, both microphones were functioning properly, and there were no signs of technical malfunction that could explain the intrusion of an unknown voice into our conversation. We continued recording, both of us nervously discussing what we just heard while keeping an eye on the audio meters to see if the mysterious voice would return. But the rest of the session was normal, with only our two voices captured by the microphones and no further unexplained audio anomalies. When we reviewed the recording the next day, the woman's voice was clearly audible in the audio file. It wasn't a case of misheard words or audio pareidolia. There was definitely a third speaker who had joined our conversation with information about Margaret and the theater fire. The voice had its own distinct characteristics, slightly higher pitched than either of ours, with an accent that sounded like it belonged to someone from the 1940s or 1950s. What made the intrusion even more unsettling was that the mysterious voice had provided specific information that we hadn't known before. We'd never encountered anyone named Margaret in our research about the Riverside Theater, and we had no information suggesting that the fire had been anything other than an electrical accident, as reported in the local newspaper from 1952. Alex suggested that we might have somehow picked up a radio transmission or interference from another electronic device, but the voice was too clear and too specifically related to our conversation topic to be explained by random radio chatter. It had responded directly to our discussion, providing relevant information rather than unrelated content you'd expect from broadcast interference. I spent the next few days researching Margaret and the Riverside Theater fire, using the mysterious voice's comment as a starting point for deeper investigation. What I found in old city records and newspaper archives was disturbing and seemed to validate the information we'd received from our unknown third speaker. Margaret Ashworth had been the theater's assistant manager in 1952, and according to insurance investigator reports that weren't published in the newspaper, she had told investigators that she'd received anonymous warnings about fire safety problems in the weeks before the blaze occurred. She'd reported these concerns to the theater owner, but no action had been taken to address the electrical issues that eventually caused the fire. More interesting was a police report I found suggesting that Margaret had suspected the fire might have been deliberately set to collect insurance money. She'd told investigators that the theater owner had been facing serious financial difficulties and had recently increased the building's fire insurance coverage. But her suspicions were apparently dismissed, and the fire was officially ruled accidental. Margaret Ashworth had died in 1987, according to the obituary I found in the local newspaper archives. She'd lived in our town for her entire life, working at various businesses downtown until her retirement in the 1970s. There was no apparent connection between her and our podcast, no reason why her voice would somehow intrude into our recording equipment decades after her death. The following week, we decided to record our next episode about the Riverside Theater fire, incorporating the new information I discovered about Margaret's suspicions and the insurance investigation. We hoped that focusing on the topic might provide additional context for the mysterious voice, or possibly trigger another unexplained intrusion. About 15 minutes into the recording session, the same woman's voice returned, this time sounding more urgent and emotional. "They threatened me," she said, her voice carrying a tremor that suggested fear or anger. "Mr. Carlson said I'd lose my job if I kept asking questions about the wiring, but I knew someone was going to get hurt." Again, the voice provided specific information that we hadn't encountered in our research. We'd found no mention of anyone named Carlson in connection with the theater, and we had no information about threats or intimidation related to the fire safety concerns that Margaret had raised. This time, Alex had the presence of mind to speak directly to the voice. "Margaret, is that you?" he asked. "Can you tell us more about what happened at the theater?" But there was no response. The mysterious voice had delivered its message and then disappeared, leaving us with more questions and another research lead to pursue. The rest of our recording session was normal, with no further unexplained audio. My investigation into Mr. Carlson revealed that Robert Carlson had been the owner of the Riverside Theater in 1952, and that he had indeed filed a substantial insurance claim after the fire destroyed the building. What I found most interesting was that Carlson had left town within 6 months of collecting the insurance payout, selling his other local business interests, and relocating to California with no forwarding address. The insurance company's investigation file, which I was able to access through a Freedom of Information request, contained notes suggesting that the company had been suspicious of Carlson's claim but had been unable to prove fraud. Margaret Ashworth had been their primary source of information about potential safety violations and financial motives, but she had apparently stopped cooperating with the investigation after receiving what the notes described as pressure from local business interests. Over the following months, the mysterious voice appeared in 5 more of our podcast recordings, always providing historically accurate information that we were able to verify through subsequent research. Margaret's voice guided us to discover corruption, cover-ups, and hidden connections that revealed the Riverside Theater fire to be part of a larger pattern of insurance fraud that had occurred in our town during the early 1950s. Each time the voice appeared, it provided specific details that led us to archival materials we would never have found otherwise. Margaret seemed to be using our podcast as a way of finally telling the complete story about the fire and the circumstances that had prevented the truth from being revealed during her lifetime. The final intrusion from Margaret's voice came during our last recording about the theater fire. "Thank you for listening," she said, her voice sounding peaceful and resolved. "The truth needed to be told, and you've given me the chance to finally say what I couldn't say when I was alive." We never heard from Margaret again, despite continuing to record episodes about other local history topics. Her voice had appeared only in connection with the Riverside Theater story, providing the missing pieces that allowed us to uncover the full truth about the fire and the corruption that had covered up its real cause. The experience changed how I think about the relationship between historical research and the people who lived through the events we study. Margaret's voice had reached across decades to provide information that existed nowhere in official records, using our recording equipment as a communication channel to ensure that her knowledge wouldn't be lost forever. Our podcast episodes about the Riverside Theater fire have become some of our most popular, partly because of the fascinating historical revelations, but also because of the mysterious way we obtained some of our information. We've been careful not to sensationalize Margaret's contributions, presenting them as part of our research process, while letting listeners draw their own conclusions about the source of our most intriguing discoveries. The recordings remain in our archives as evidence that historical truth sometimes finds ways of emerging, even when official records have been suppressed or destroyed. Margaret's voice served as a bridge between past and present, using our podcast to complete the historical record and ensure that the real story of the Riverside Theater fire would finally be preserved for future generations who might be interested in understanding what really happened during those tumultuous years in our town's hidden history. I woke up around 3 a.m. during a backpacking trip in the Cascade Range, needing to step outside my tent for a few minutes before returning to sleep. It was mid-August, and I was camped at about 6,000 feet elevation in an area of alpine meadows and scattered trees that provided perfect conditions for stargazing. When I'd gone to sleep around 10 p.m., the night sky had been spectacular, a brilliant display of stars and the Milky Way that you can only see in truly dark locations far from any light pollution. But when I unzipped my tent and looked up, the sky was completely black. Not cloudy black, not the gray darkness of overcast conditions, but an absolute black that seemed to absorb light rather than simply lacking it. There were no stars visible anywhere in the sky, not a single point of light in any direction. The moon, which had been a bright crescent when I'd gone to sleep, was also gone, leaving the night darker than anything I'd ever experienced. The absence of celestial light was so complete that I couldn't see my own hand when I held it in front of my face. I fumbled for my headlamp and switched it on, expecting the familiar beam to illuminate my immediate surroundings, but the light seemed strangely muted and didn't penetrate the darkness as far as it normally would. It was as if the air itself had become thicker and more resistant to illumination. I stood outside my tent for several minutes, letting my eyes adjust and hoping that clouds would shift to reveal the stars I knew should be there. But no adjustment occurred, and no familiar constellations appeared. The sky remained uniformly black in all directions, creating a sense of being enclosed rather than standing under the vast open space of the normal night sky. What made the experience particularly unsettling was the quality of the silence that accompanied the missing stars. The normal nighttime sounds of the wilderness, insects, small animals moving through the underbrush, the distant call of owls, were completely absent. The silence was so profound that I could hear my own heartbeat and breathing with unusual clarity, as if all other sound had been drained from the environment, along with the light from the sky. I tried to orient myself using landmarks that should have been visible even in darkness. The tree line, the shape of distant ridges, the reflective surface of a small alpine lake about 50 yards from my campsite. All of these features that had been clearly visible by starlight when I'd set up camp were now invisible in the unnatural darkness. I returned to my tent to get a more powerful flashlight, thinking that perhaps my headlamp wasn't sufficient for the unusual conditions. But even with a bright LED flashlight that normally provided excellent visibility, the beam seemed to be absorbed by the darkness after traveling only a few feet. I could illuminate objects directly in front of me, but anything beyond immediate reach remained invisible. The temperature hadn't changed. The night air was still the cool, crisp atmosphere typical of high-altitude camping in late summer. There were no sounds of wind or weather that might indicate a storm system moving through the area. The missing stars seemed to be an isolated phenomenon, affecting visibility without altering any other environmental conditions. I decided to stay awake and monitor the situation, hoping that whatever was causing the unusual darkness would pass and normal nighttime conditions would return. I sat outside my tent with my flashlight, occasionally scanning the sky for any sign of returning starlight or moon visibility. Around 4 a.m., I noticed a subtle change in the quality of the darkness. It wasn't getting lighter, but the absolute black began to show very faint variations in density, as if layers of darkness were shifting or thinning in some areas. I could begin to make out the vague shapes of nearby trees and the general outline of the surrounding landscape, though still no celestial objects were visible. The gradual return of normal darkness continued over the next hour. By 5 a.m., I could see the familiar silhouettes of mountains against the horizon, and my flashlight began to penetrate the darkness with its normal effectiveness. But the sky remained empty of stars, showing only the deep blue black of pre-dawn darkness, without any visible celestial objects. It wasn't until after 6 a.m., when the eastern horizon began to show the first hints of sunrise, that I could see stars appearing in the western sky. They emerged gradually, as if someone were slowly turning up the brightness of the night sky, until the normal complement of visible stars was restored. By the time full daylight arrived, the night sky had returned to what should have been its normal appearance during the early morning hours. I spent the rest of that day trying to understand what could have caused the complete disappearance of all visible celestial objects for over 3 hours. I considered atmospheric conditions that might create unusual light absorption or refraction, but I'd never heard of any weather phenomena that could make stars completely invisible while leaving other environmental conditions unchanged. I also researched astronomical events that might explain the missing stars. Solar flares, magnetic storms, and other space weather can sometimes affect radio communications and satellite systems, but I found no reports of any solar activity that would impact visible light from celestial objects reaching Earth's surface. Most puzzling was the localized nature of the phenomenon. When I hiked out the next day and talked with other campers, I encountered on the trail none of them reported experiencing unusual darkness or missing stars during the previous night. According to everyone I spoke with, the night had been clear with excellent visibility and normal stargazing conditions. I checked weather reports and astronomical data for that specific date and location, but found no recorded atmospheric anomalies or celestial events that could explain what I'd experienced. According to all official sources, the night of August 15th had featured clear skies with normal visibility throughout the Cascade Range. The experience left me questioning whether I had somehow experienced a localized phenomenon that affected only my immediate area, or whether I had encountered something that existed outside normal atmospheric and astronomical processes. The missing stars had been too complete and too systematic to be explained by conventional weather or optical effects. I've returned to the same camping area several times since then, always hoping to observe normal nighttime conditions and confirm that my experience had been an isolated anomaly. But every subsequent visit has featured normal star visibility and typical alpine night sky conditions. Whatever caused the missing stars that August night has never repeated itself. The experience changed how I think about the reliability of the night skies and the assumption that celestial objects will always be visible under clear conditions. For 3 hours, I existed in a world where the familiar markers of navigation and time had simply vanished, leaving me in darkness that seemed to operate according to different rules than normal atmospheric physics. Whether I experienced some kind of rare atmospheric phenomenon, encountered a localized effect created by unknown technology, or briefly stepped into a version of reality where different physical laws applied, the missing stars remain the most inexplicable experience of my outdoor adventures. The night sky that had been my constant companion during years of wilderness camping had simply ceased to exist, leaving me alone under a dome of absolute darkness that contained no trace of the universe beyond Earth's atmosphere. The stars eventually returned, but their temporary absence served as a reminder that even the most fundamental aspects of our environment, the presence of celestial objects that have guided human navigation for thousands of years, can sometimes disappear without warning or explanation, leaving us isolated in darkness that reveals how little we actually understand about the consistency and reliability of the world we think we can count on to remain constant around us. I lived in a small town called Cedar Ridge, about 3 miles from Fort Morrison, a mid-sized Army installation in central Georgia, where my father worked as a civilian contractor. Our house was close enough to the base that we'd grown accustomed to the constant background noise of military activity, helicopters flying training missions, the distant sound of vehicles moving around the facility, and occasional weapons testing that would rattle our windows. After 18 years of living there, the sounds had become part of the normal rhythm of daily life. On a Tuesday night in March 2019, everything went silent. I was in my bedroom around 11 p.m., finishing homework for my senior year of high school, when I gradually became aware that something was wrong. The usual low hum of activity from the base had stopped completely. No helicopter rotors in the distance, no vehicle engines, no sounds of the generators and equipment that normally created a constant backdrop of military operation. The silence was so profound that it felt almost physical, like a heavy blanket had been dropped over the entire area. At first, I thought there might be a power outage affecting the base. But when I looked out my window toward Fort Morrison, I could see lights still burning in buildings across the facility. The base appeared to be fully operational from a visual perspective, but it was producing no sound whatsoever. It was as if someone had muted all audio from the installation while leaving the visual elements untouched. I went downstairs to ask my parents if they'd noticed the unusual quiet, and found them both standing on our back porch, staring toward the base with expressions of concern and confusion. My father, who'd worked at Fort Morrison for over 20 years, had never experienced anything like the complete cessation of all noise from the facility. "Something's not right," he said, checking his phone to see if he'd received any emergency notifications from his workplace. "The base doesn't just go quiet like this. There's always activity, always something running. This level of silence isn't normal for any operational status I'm familiar with." We stood on the porch for several minutes, listening to the eerie quiet that had replaced the familiar sounds of military activity. The silence extended beyond just the base. Even the usual nighttime sounds of our rural area seemed muted. No insects, no distant traffic, no dogs barking in neighboring houses. It was as if all sound in our immediate area had been dampened or suppressed. My mother suggested that perhaps there was a security exercise or training scenario that required noise discipline, but my father shook his head. Even during the most restrictive exercises, you can still hear basic operations, generators, HVAC systems, essential equipment. What we're experiencing now is the complete absence of all mechanical sound. That's not possible if the base is actually functioning. Around midnight, the silence was broken by a single, low-frequency tone that seemed to come from the direction of the base. It was barely audible, more felt than heard, like the deep vibration of a massive machine starting up. The tone lasted for exactly 60 seconds, then stopped, returning the area to the same profound silence we'd been experiencing. "Did you feel that?" my father asked. "That wasn't a normal bass sound. I've never heard anything like it in all my years working there." The tone repeated every hour on the hour throughout the night, at 1 a.m., 2 a.m., 3 a.m., and so on. Each time, it was the same duration, the same deep frequency, and the same sense that it was being generated by something enormous and powerful located somewhere within the base perimeter. My father tried calling his supervisor to ask about the unusual activity, but his calls went straight to voicemail. He also tried the base's main switchboard, but got only busy signals despite repeated attempts. It was as if the communication systems were either overloaded or deliberately restricting incoming calls. We stayed awake most of the night, monitoring the situation and trying to understand what was happening at Fort Morrison. The hourly tones continued with mechanical precision, but no other sounds emerged from the base. Whatever was producing the silence had maintained it for over 8 hours, with no sign of returning to normal operations. Around 6 a.m., we heard the distant sound of helicopters approaching from the southeast. But instead of the familiar military aircraft we usually saw around the base, these helicopters had a different sound signature: deeper, quieter rotors that suggested larger or more advanced aircraft than anything normally stationed at Fort Morrison. The helicopters passed overhead without landing at the base, continuing northwest until their sounds faded beyond our hearing range. About an hour later, we saw similar aircraft returning from the same direction, again passing over without stopping at the local facility. My father, growing increasingly concerned about the situation and his inability to contact anyone at the base, decided to drive to the main gate to see if he could get information about what was happening. But when he returned 30 minutes later, he was more puzzled than before. The gate guards acted like everything was completely normal, he reported. They said the base was operating under standard protocols and that there were no unusual activities or exercises taking place. But when I mentioned the silence and the hourly tones, they claimed they didn't know what I was talking about. According to my father, the security personnel at the gate seemed genuinely confused by his questions about unusual sounds or the absence of normal base activity. They insisted that Fort Morrison was functioning normally and suggested that perhaps he'd been experiencing some kind of auditory problem that made him unable to hear the usual operational sounds. The silence continued through Wednesday morning, broken only by the hourly low-frequency tones that had become the only sound coming from the base. My father called in sick to work, partly because he was concerned about the situation, and partly because he wanted to continue monitoring what was happening at the facility where he'd spent most of his career. Around 2 p.m. on Wednesday, normal sounds gradually returned to Fort Morrison. We first heard the familiar hum of generators and HVAC systems, then the distant noise of vehicles and equipment, and finally the resumption of helicopter training flights that typically occurred during afternoon hours. Within an hour, the base sounded exactly as it always had, with no indication that anything unusual had ever occurred. The hourly tones stopped as abruptly as they had begun, with the 2 p.m. tone being the last one we heard. From that point forward, Fort Morrison returned to its normal pattern of activity, with all the familiar sounds and rhythms that had characterized our daily life for nearly 2 decades. My father returned to work on Thursday and cautiously asked colleagues about the previous day's events, but no one else reported experiencing any unusual silence or hearing any low frequency tones. According to everyone he spoke with, Tuesday and Wednesday had been completely normal days with standard operations and no significant incidents. It's like it never happened, he told us that evening. People look at me like I'm crazy when I mention the silence or the tones. Either everyone is lying, or somehow our family was the only one who experienced what we experienced. We researched possible explanations for localized audio phenomena, thinking that perhaps atmospheric conditions or some kind of technical interference could have created the impression of silence while normal sounds were actually present. But we found no scientific literature describing effects that could suppress all mechanical noise from a large facility while leaving visual elements unaffected. He graduated from high school a few months later and left Cedar Ridge for college, but I still visit my parents regularly. Every time I return, I'm struck by how normal Fort Morrison sounds, the constant background of military activity that I'd grown up with and that had been completely absent during those strange 30 hours in March. The experience changed how our family thought about the base and the activities that might occur there beyond the routine training and administrative functions that were visible to civilian employees and neighbors. For one night and day, Fort Morrison had become something different, a facility capable of operations that produced no detectable sound and that generated mysterious tones suggesting capabilities far beyond anything normally associated with a conventional Army installation. Whatever happened during those silent hours remains unexplained, but it demonstrated that military facilities can transition into operational modes that exist beyond public awareness or acknowledgement. Mot, the base that had been part of our daily soundscape for nearly 20 years, briefly revealed that it was capable of activities that required complete audio suppression and that involved technologies producing effects we'd never encountered before. The silence taught us that even familiar military installations can harbor capabilities that emerge only under specific circumstances, transforming routine facilities into something that operates according to protocols and technologies that exist beyond the normal scope of acknowledged military activities. Fort Morrison returned to its familiar patterns, but with the knowledge that beneath the surface of routine operations lay potential for activities that could make an entire base disappear from the auditory world while continuing to function in ways that left no trace except for hourly reminders that something vast and powerful was operating according to schedules and purposes that civilian neighbors were never meant to understand. I was about 6 miles into a solo day hike on the Cascade Trail in North Carolina when I encountered a man sitting on a fallen log beside the path, wearing clothes that seemed oddly out of place for backcountry hiking. Instead of the typical outdoor gear you'd expect to see on a remote mountain trail, he was dressed in what appeared to be casual street clothes, a simple gray shirt, dark pants, and shoes that looked more appropriate for urban walking than navigating rocky terrain. The man appeared to be in his 30s, with an unremarkable appearance that would have blended into any crowd, but there was something about his demeanor that seemed strangely calm and observant. He was sitting perfectly still, not checking a phone or consulting a map or doing any of the things hikers typically do during rest breaks. He was simply watching the trail with the kind of patient attention that suggested he was waiting for something specific. "Beautiful day for a hike," he said as I approached, though his tone carried an odd quality that made the conventional greeting sound somehow significant rather than casual. I agreed and was about to continue past him when he stood up and asked if I had a moment to talk. There was something compelling about his request, a sense that this wasn't a random encounter with another hiker, but something that had been deliberately arranged. I stopped and asked what he wanted to discuss. "I know this is going to sound strange," he said, speaking with the careful precision of someone who had rehearsed important words, "but I'm not from your time. I'm from about 40 years in the future, and I'm here because there are things you need to know about what's coming." My first reaction was to assume I was dealing with someone experiencing psychological problems or perhaps playing an elaborate prank. People don't travel through time, and they certainly don't encounter time travelers on routine hiking trails. But instead of walking away immediately, something made me pause and listen to what he had to say. "I understand your skepticism," he continued, apparently reading my expression accurately. "Time travel sounds like science fiction, and most people from your era wouldn't believe it's possible. But the technology exists in my time, and there are protocols for making contact with specific individuals in the past when certain conditions require intervention." He explained that he was part of what he called a temporal observation program that monitored historical events and occasionally made contact with people in the past when future knowledge could prevent catastrophic outcomes. According to him, I had been selected for contact because of decisions I would make over the next few years that would have significant consequences for technological development in ways I couldn't currently understand. "What kind of decisions?" I asked, finding myself drawn into the conversation despite its impossible premise. "You're going to be offered a position with a technology company next year," he said, providing details about my career that were accurate but not particularly secret. "The work will involve developing algorithms for data analysis that seem beneficial but will eventually be used for mass surveillance and behavioral control. The company will present the project as consumer convenience and security enhancement, but the real applications are much more invasive." He described my future job offer with remarkable specificity, including details about the company, the salary range, and the names of people I would work with. Some of the information was publicly available, but other details seemed to reflect insider knowledge of corporate plans that hadn't been announced publicly. "Why should I believe you?" I asked. "Anyone could research my background and make predictions about likely career opportunities." In response, he pulled out what appeared to be a smartphone, but with a design that was unlike any device I'd seen. The screen was more flexible than current technology allows, and the interface showed information in ways that seemed more intuitive and advanced than contemporary software. He showed me what he claimed were news articles from my future describing events that would occur over the next several years. The articles covered political developments, technological breakthroughs, and social changes that were plausible extensions of current trends, but included specific details that would be impossible to fabricate convincingly. Most disturbing were articles describing the consequences of the surveillance algorithms I would apparently help develop, showing how they would eventually be used to monitor and control civilian populations in ways that fundamentally changed the nature of privacy and personal freedom. The technology you'll help create will be presented as beneficial, he explained. Personalized advertising, improved security, better traffic management, but it will evolve into systems that monitor every aspect of human behavior and use that information to influence decisions at individual and societal levels. He showed me additional information from his device, including technical documentation that appeared to describe the algorithms I would supposedly develop. The mathematical concepts were advanced but comprehensible, and the applications he described were logical extensions of current machine learning and data analysis techniques. What am I supposed to do with this information? I asked. Even if I believe you, which I'm not sure I do, I can't base major life decisions on a conversation with someone who claims to be from the future. I'm not asking you to change your career path entirely, he said, just to be aware of the implications of the work you'll be offered and to consider building in safeguards that will prevent the technology from being misused. Small changes in the initial design can have enormous impacts on how systems evolve over decades. He provided specific technical suggestions for algorithm modifications that would maintain the beneficial applications while making mass surveillance more difficult. The suggestions were sophisticated and demonstrated deep understanding of both current technology and likely future developments. We talked for over an hour, covering topics ranging from technological development to social changes that he claimed would occur over the coming decades. His knowledge of current events was perfect, but his perspective on them was subtly different, as if he were viewing them from a historical distance that allowed him to see patterns and consequences that weren't obvious to people living through them in real time. How many people do you contact like this? I asked. Very few, he replied. Time travel is heavily regulated in my era, and contact with the past is only authorized when computer models predict that specific interventions can prevent significant negative outcomes. You're one of maybe a dozen people in this time period who receive this kind of information. As our conversation concluded, he stood up and walked a short distance up the trail, then turned back to face me. I need to return to my own time now, he said. Remember what we've discussed and consider the long-term implications of the choices you'll be making. The future isn't fixed, but it's strongly influenced by decisions that seem minor at the time they're made. He walked around a bend in the trail and disappeared from view. When I followed a few minutes later, expecting to see him continuing his hike, the trail was empty. I searched the area for side paths or places where he might have left the main trail, but found no sign of him. It was as if he had simply vanished. Over the following year, the job offer he had described materialized exactly as he had predicted, including the company name, the position details, and the people involved. The work involved developing data analysis algorithms for applications that were presented exactly as he had described, beneficial consumer services that could easily be adapted for surveillance purposes. I accepted the position, but implemented the safeguards he had suggested, building in design elements that would make the algorithms useful for their stated purposes while preventing the kind of comprehensive monitoring capabilities he had warned about. My colleagues viewed these modifications as interesting technical features, unaware that they were specifically designed to prevent future misuse. I've never encountered the time traveler again, despite returning to the same hiking trail many times hoping for additional contact. But the experience fundamentally changed how I approach technology development, making me more aware of the long-term implications of design decisions that seem purely technical at the time they're made. Whether the man I met was actually from the future or simply someone with extraordinary insight into technological trends and social developments, his warnings about the potential misuse of surveillance technology have proven remarkably accurate. The algorithms I helped develop have remained useful for their intended applications while avoiding the privacy violations that similar systems have enabled in other contexts. The encounter taught me that the future isn't determined by large historical forces alone, but also by countless individual decisions made by people who may not realize the long-term significance of their choices. Sometimes a conversation on a hiking trail can provide the perspective needed to see beyond immediate circumstances and consider how current actions will influence developments that won't be fully understood for decades. I continue to work in technology development, but with a heightened awareness that the systems we create today will shape the world that future generations inherit. The time traveler's visit, real or not, provided a reminder that responsibility for the future lies with people making decisions in the present, and that sometimes the most important changes result from small modifications made by individuals who understand the difference between what technology can do and what technology should do. I've always been a vivid dreamer, but the dream I had on Thursday night, October 12th, was different from anything I'd ever experienced. Instead of the usual fragmented, surreal imagery that characterizes most dreams, this felt like watching a documentary, clear, sequential, and detailed enough that I could remember every moment when I woke up the next morning. In the dream, I was standing at my bedroom window, looking out at my backyard, when I saw lights approaching from the southeast. At first, they looked like aircraft navigation lights, but as they got closer, I could see that they were arranged in a triangular pattern and moving with the kind of smooth, silent glide that no conventional aircraft could achieve. The object descended slowly toward my yard, hovering about 20 feet above my lawn, before settling down with surprising gentleness for something that appeared to be metallic and massive. The craft was roughly triangular, maybe 40 feet across, with a dark metallic surface that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. There were no visible seams, windows, or external features that would indicate how it was constructed or operated. It simply sat on my lawn like a piece of advanced technology that had materialized from nowhere. In the dream, I watched from my window for what felt like 10 or 15 minutes as the craft remained motionless in my backyard. Then, without any sound or visible preparation, it lifted straight up, accelerated rapidly, and disappeared into the night sky, leaving my yard exactly as it had been before its arrival. The dream was so realistic and detailed that I woke up with the strange feeling that I had actually witnessed something rather than simply imagined it. The images were sharp and consistent, lacking the fuzzy logic and impossible elements that usually characterize dream scenarios. I could remember specific details about the craft's appearance, the way the lights moved during its approach, and even the precise location where it had landed in my yard. Friday morning, I went outside to get the newspaper and immediately noticed something that made my stomach drop. There were burn marks in my lawn, positioned in a triangular pattern that exactly matched the shape and size of the craft I'd seen in my dream. The grass was scorched in three distinct areas, each about 6 feet in diameter, with the burned patches forming a perfect triangle in the center of my backyard. The burn marks were clearly fresh. The grass was blackened and brittle, and the soil underneath showed signs of having been exposed to intense heat. The damage was too precise and too geometrically arranged to be the result of any natural cause, and the pattern was too specific to be coincidental given my dream the night before. I walked around the burn marks, measuring the distances between them and comparing the layout to my memory of the dream craft. The dimensions matched perfectly, a triangular pattern with about 12 feet between each point, exactly where I had seen the craft's landing supports make contact with the ground during my vivid dream. Most unsettling was the fact that the burn marks showed characteristics that I hadn't specifically noticed in the dream, but that seemed consistent with what I'd observed. The grass was burned in circular patterns that suggested contact with round, heated objects, and the intensity of the damage was greatest at the center of each circle, fading gradually toward the edges. I tried to think of rational explanations for the burn marks that wouldn't require accepting that my dream had somehow documented a real event. Perhaps someone had used my yard for a bonfire or other activity that had left the triangular pattern, but the precision of the arrangement and the fresh appearance of the damage made such explanations seem unlikely. I also considered the possibility that I had sleepwalked and somehow created the burn marks myself, perhaps using some kind of tool or chemical that could produce the scorched grass pattern. But I had no access to equipment that could create such precise circular burns, and the triangular arrangement would have required careful measurement and planning that didn't seem consistent with unconscious activity. Over the next few days, I researched everything I could find about unusual lawn damage, looking for natural or human-caused phenomena that might explain the triangular burn pattern. I learned about fairy rings, fungal infections, and various plant diseases that can create circular dead spots in grass, but none of them matched the appearance or arrangement of what I'd found in my yard. I also looked into the possibility that the damage could have been caused by aircraft landing lights, flares, or other airborne sources of heat. But commercial and military aircraft don't typically land in residential backyards, and any emergency landing would have left much more extensive damage than the precise circular burns I'd discovered. A week after finding the burn marks, I decided to take soil samples from the damaged areas and have them tested by a local agricultural extension office. I told the technician that I was concerned about possible chemical contamination that might have killed the grass, hoping to get scientific analysis of what had caused the damage. The soil test results were puzzling and didn't provide the clear answers I'd hoped for. The pH levels in the burned areas were significantly higher than in the surrounding soil, suggesting exposure to intense alkaline conditions. The samples also contained trace amounts of metallic elements that weren't present in the undamaged portions of my lawn, specifically unusual concentrations of titanium and rare earth metals that had no obvious source. "This is interesting," the technician told me when he called with the results. "The soil chemistry in your damaged areas suggests exposure to very high temperatures, possibly exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. But there's no obvious source for that kind of heat in a residential setting. The metallic residues are also unusual. They're not consistent with any common chemicals or fertilizers that might accidentally contaminate lawn soil." I asked him what could produce such high temperatures and leave behind traces of rare metals, but he had no explanation that fit a suburban backyard setting. "Industrial smelting processes can reach those temperatures," he said, "but they require massive equipment and controlled environments. I've never seen soil analysis like this from a residential property." The burn marks remained visible in my lawn for several months, with the grass refusing to grow back despite my attempts to reseed and fertilize the damaged areas. Even after I removed the scorched soil and replaced it with new topsoil and sod, the triangular pattern remained faintly visible as areas where the new grass grew more slowly and with a slightly different color than the surrounding lawn. I never had another dream like the one that preceded the discovery of the burn marks, but the experience fundamentally changed how I think about the relationship between dreams and reality. The precision with which my dream had documented details that I later found physically manifested in my yard suggested either an extraordinary coincidence or some kind of connection between unconscious experience and external events. I've researched reports of similar incidents, people who dreamed about UFO encounters and then found physical evidence that seemed to corroborate their dreams. While such accounts are often dismissed as fantasy or hoax, I found enough similar stories to suggest that the phenomenon I experienced wasn't entirely unique. The most unsettling aspect of the experience wasn't the burn marks themselves, but the implication that something had occurred in my backyard that I had somehow observed or participated in while unconscious. Whether I had witnessed an actual craft landing through some form of remote viewing, or whether something had influenced my dreams to create a record of events I wasn't consciously aware of, the correlation between my nighttime vision and the physical evidence was too precise to be explained by chance. The burn marks have finally faded from my lawn, but the memory of finding them remains vivid. Sometimes I wonder if the dream was a way of processing or remembering an encounter that I experienced, but that was somehow blocked from normal conscious recall. Perhaps what I thought was a dream was actually a fragmentary memory of witnessing something that I wasn't supposed to remember clearly. I continue to pay attention to my dreams, especially ones that feel unusually realistic or detailed, but I've never again had the experience of finding physical evidence that corroborates dream content. The single incident remains an isolated event that challenged my understanding of the boundaries between sleeping and waking consciousness, between imagination and observation, between the private world of dreams and the shared reality of physical evidence. The triangular burn marks served as proof that something extraordinary had occurred in my backyard, whether I had observed it directly or only through the mysterious channels that sometimes allow unconscious awareness to document events that conscious perception never registers. My dream had been more than imagination. It had been a record of something real, something that left traces in soil chemistry and grass patterns that took months to fade from the landscape, but that will remain permanently etched in my understanding of how much can happen around us that we're only dimly aware of, even when it occurs literally in our own backyards. I worked as a freight train conductor for Norfolk Southern for 12 years, running regular routes between Atlanta and Birmingham on trains that carried everything from automotive parts to agricultural products through the industrial corridor of Alabama and Georgia. I knew every mile of track, every signal, every station, and siding along the 148-mile route. The railroad infrastructure in that region hasn't changed significantly in decades, and experienced conductors develop an almost automatic awareness of landmarks, timing, and the rhythm of familiar runs. On a Tuesday night in September 2020, I was working the overnight shift on a southbound freight train, a routine run that I'd completed hundreds of times before. We were about 60 miles south of Atlanta, traveling through a section of rural Alabama where the tracks pass through small towns and farming communities that are mostly dark after midnight. The engineer, Mike Torino, had been running this route almost as long as I had, and we both knew the territory well enough to operate safely, even in poor visibility conditions. Around 2:30 a.m., we were approaching what should have been an empty stretch of track between Coleman and Birmingham when our headlight illuminated a passenger station platform on the right side of the tracks. This was immediately puzzling because there were no passenger stations anywhere along that section of route. Norfolk Southern carried only freight traffic through that area, and passenger rail service had been discontinued in rural Alabama decades earlier. The station was fully illuminated with period-appropriate lighting that looked like it belonged to the 1940s or 1950s. The platform was covered by a traditional railroad station canopy, and I could see a brick building with large windows and classic architectural details that matched the golden age of American passenger rail service. Everything looked authentic and well maintained, as if it were an active station serving regular passenger traffic. But what made the sight truly surreal was the presence of people on the platform. Maybe 20 or 30 passengers were waiting with luggage, dressed in clothing that looked like it came from the mid-20th century. The women wore dresses and hats that reflected 1940s fashion, while the men were in suits and overcoats that looked formal by contemporary standards. Everyone appeared to be patiently waiting for a train, checking watches, and occasionally looking up the tracks in our direction. "Do you see this?" I asked Mike over the radio, pointing toward the illuminated platform as our train approached. "See what?" Mike replied. "There's nothing out there but farmland." I looked again at the station, which was now clearly visible in our headlight beam and the glow from the platform lighting. The passengers were still there, still waiting, and I could see details like period luggage, vintage signs, and even what appeared to be a station master in uniform standing near the building entrance. "There's a whole passenger station right there," I said, trying to keep the confusion out of my voice. "Full platform, people waiting, the works. You don't see any of that?" Mike was quiet for a moment, then responded with concern. "Jim, there's nothing there. Just empty track and fields. Are you feeling okay?" As our train passed the station, I had a clear view of the entire facility. It appeared to be a complete, functioning passenger terminal with waiting rooms, ticket windows, and all the infrastructure necessary for regular train service. The people on the platform looked up at our freight train with mild interest, as if they were accustomed to seeing various types of rail traffic pass through their station. But according to Mike, who was sitting just a few feet away from me in the same locomotive, none of it existed. He saw only the dark countryside that should have been there according to our knowledge of the route. For him, we were passing through an empty section of track with no structures, no lights, and certainly no people waiting for passenger trains that no longer ran. The discrepancy between what I was seeing and what Mike was experiencing was deeply unsettling. I'd never had hallucinations or vision problems that would explain seeing such detailed, realistic imagery that wasn't actually there. But I also couldn't understand how an entire illuminated train station with dozens of people could be invisible to someone sitting right next to me. As we continued south, I tried to research the location where I'd seen the Phantom Station. I checked historical railroad maps, old timetables, and regional transportation records to see if there had ever been a passenger station in that area. What I found was evidence that a station called Millerville had operated at approximately that location from 1925 until 1954, serving passengers on what was then the Louisville and Nashville Railroad. The historical documentation included photographs of Millerville Station that matched exactly what I had seen from our passing train. The architectural details, the platform configuration, even the style of lighting and signage were identical to what I'd observed during our night run. But Millerville had been demolished in 1955, a year after passenger service ended, and the land had been sold to local farmers who used it for agricultural purposes. I made discreet inquiries with other conductors and engineers who worked the same route, asking if anyone had ever noticed unusual sights or experienced anything strange during night runs through that section of Alabama. Most people had no reports of anything unusual, but I found two experienced railroaders who described encounters similar to mine. Frank Kowalski, a 20-year veteran engineer, told me that he'd occasionally seen lights and structures along the route that didn't match any known facilities. "Sometimes you see things at night that aren't supposed to be there," he said. "Old stations, signals that were removed years ago, even trains that don't show up on dispatch records. Most guys don't talk about it because it sounds crazy, but it happens more often than people admit." Maria Santos, a conductor with 15 years' experience, described seeing what she called ghost stations during night runs through various parts of the Southeastern Rail Network. "They show up for maybe 30 seconds as you pass by," she explained. "Always at night, always in areas where stations used to exist decades ago. You see them clear as day, but they're gone when you look back, and nobody else ever sees them at the same time." Over the following months, I began paying closer attention during night runs through the area where I'd seen Millerville Station. I never observed the phantom facility again, but I started noticing other anomalies, signal lights that appeared in locations where no signals existed, section maintenance equipment that vanished when I looked directly at it, and occasionally the sound of other trains on parallel tracks where no parallel tracks existed. The experiences suggested that railroad infrastructure from earlier eras somehow persisted in a form that could occasionally be perceived by people who spent enough time working the rails. Perhaps the constant passage of trains over decades had created some kind of imprint in the landscape, a residual memory of facilities and activities that had once been essential parts of the transportation network. I retired from Norfolk Southern in 2022, partly due to age and partly because the accumulating strange experiences during night runs had made me question my ability to distinguish between current reality and historical echoes that seem to exist alongside our normal rail operations. But I still drive past sections of abandoned railroad right-of-way sometimes, and occasionally I see lights or structures that don't appear on any current maps. The railroad industry has a long tradition of stories about phantom trains, ghost signals, and other supernatural encounters reported by people who work the rails during overnight hours. Most railroaders have learned not to discuss such experiences in detail, understanding that official reports of unusual sightings can raise questions about mental fitness and job performance that aren't worth the risk to their careers. But the phantom infrastructure exists alongside our current rail system, occasionally revealing itself to people who have developed the sensitivity to perceive layers of transportation history that operated according to different schedules and served destinations that no longer exist in our current geography. Millerville Station still serves passengers who dressed in styles from 70 years ago, waiting for trains that run on timetables that were discontinued decades before current rail workers were born. The tracks continue to carry freight through that section of Alabama, but they also support passenger service that exists in parallel time, connecting stations that were demolished years ago and serving travelers who journey between destinations that exist in the spaces between our mapped infrastructure and the historical transportation networks that shaped the development of the American Southeast. Sometimes, for 30 seconds, as a modern freight train passes through, the boundaries become permeable enough for contemporary railroad workers to glimpse the passenger service that continues to operate according to the original vision of what American rail transportation was supposed to become.